Good evening. Thank you for joining us for tonight's webinar. I would now like to introduce Laura Wood, Renal Cancer Research Coordinator at the Cleveland Clinic Toxic Cancer Institute, who will be leading tonight's presentation. Following the webinar, we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes of question and answer where you will have an opportunity to type in any questions you might have for Laura, and we will try to answer as many as we can in the time that we have left. So now I would like to turn it over to Laura.
Hi, good evening, and welcome to the Kidney Cancer Association program on clinical trials. Thanks, Carrie, for the introduction. My name is Laura Wood, as Carrie mentioned, and I'm the Renal Cancer Research Coordinator at the Cleveland Clinic Toxic Cancer Institute, and am very honored to be able to share with you tonight what is going on with clinical trials, why they're of value, and what your options are as far as treatment on a clinical trial and what to consider and be aware of. So please feel free to submit your questions to Carrie, and I'll be happy to answer any of those that I can, and those that we can't, we'll follow up with individually. So I'd like to thank the supporters for the opportunity for the Kidney Cancer Association to provide this program to you. And what we're really talking about tonight is, do you know the way to the FDA? Every drug that you take or have ever taken has most likely been through a clinical trial process on its way to the FDA for review and approval or denial of approval. The only drugs as such, and they're not really drugs, that do not go through the FDA approval process are complementary or herbal therapies. There may be clinical trials involved in those, but we're not discussing those types of products tonight. So the objectives of the program tonight really are to provide you an overview of clinical trials. Why are they done? Why is it important that they be done to look at safety and effectiveness of drugs? As part of that clinical trial process, what are the phases or the steps that drugs go through on their way to the FDA? How do you, as a patient or a family member, find out about clinical trials? In addition to discussions with your physician, what are some of the other options you have to investigate and search out clinical trials? And a brief update on clinical trials that are currently ongoing in kidney cancer. And this information changes very rapidly, but at least to provide you a bit of information on what we have at the present time. So let's start with what are clinical trials. These are research studies, investigational studies that involve people in order to answer questions about new ways to treat cancer, to find and diagnose cancer, to prevent the actual occurrence or recurrence of cancer, and to manage symptoms of cancer or side effects of treatment. And so these are the types of questions that clinical trials relative to oncology or cancer will try to answer. They evaluate the effectiveness and safety of new drugs. So these are drugs that are not previously available, that have been developed in research labs. Initial testing has been done, and now we're going to begin phase 1 testing in humans as drugs go through the phases of research. Clinical trials also evaluate combinations of treatment strategies. For example, drug A plus drug B. Those could both be already approved drugs individually, and now we're going to look at the safety and effectiveness of combining them together in different doses. They also look at the sequence of treatment. Is drug A better tolerated and more effective when it's followed by drug B, or is drug B better when followed by drug A? So looking at sequence as opposed to combination. And clinical trials also involve new or improvements in surgical procedures, radiation therapy techniques, implanted pump devices, be it for drug administration or for pain medication administration, and those are referred to often as device trials. It's an implanted pump to deliver a medication over time, and what is its safety and effectiveness in doing the procedure it's designed, such as drug infusion. Why are clinical trials important? They are important because they translate the results of basic scientific research that's been done at the laboratory bench, looking at better ways to prevent or to diagnose or to more effectively treat cancer, or for those situations where medications or new drugs are available to help reduce side effects, such as Zofran, Kytril, some of the antiemetics, went through clinical trials to ensure that they were safe, what was an appropriate dose and frequency, and did drugs such as Kytril and Zofran do what they were designed to do in improving and minimizing nausea associated with cancer treatments. So the more individuals participate in clinical trials, the faster we can answer the research questions. Every clinical trial involves a certain number of participants, and that is decisions that are made as the clinical trials are being written in collaboration with the FDA to be able to answer research questions, to be able to support whether one treatment is more effective than another or more tolerable. Many clinical trials have quality of life questionnaires that look at benefit with acceptable degrees of effectiveness and side effects. And clinical trials also help us develop what are called treatment algorithms, how to recommend the best treatment for individual patients. And many of you have been through some very interesting, challenging, frustrating discussions with your physician as we have more therapies available to treat kidney cancer. We often run into difficult discussions on, we have 3 drugs available, there is data to support that they work in kidney cancer for a given % of patients, but whether drug A works better after B or B after A, those are questions we're still trying to answer. So we're really at the point of really trying to develop treatment algorithms based on type of kidney cancer, extent of kidney cancer, prior therapies. So we're continuing to try to improve the treatment decision-making process. And as I mentioned before, we have come a huge way in having drugs available. I, as a nurse, go back to the high-dose interleukin-2 studies in the early 1990s and have been in oncology and clinical trials since then, as we saw 6 drugs or treatment plans receive FDA approval since 2005 in December of that year. And so we've made significant progress with the safety and effectiveness and approval of sorafenib, sunitinib, temsirolimus, bevacizumab plus interferon, everolimus, and recently pazopanib, and that was in 2009. Nothing is going to be FDA approved new therapy-wise in 2010, but we continue to improve our knowledge through ongoing clinical trials of how better, more tolerated, more effective therapies can be given based on what we have available, looking at sequence and dosing. So when we look at the process of clinical trials, there are 4 phases of clinical trials. Phase 1 is the earliest human studies. Those are clinical trials that are referred to as dose-finding studies. There are a small number of patients, and we look at the dose and schedule of a medication. Based on positive results, and I'll explain that in more detail shortly, of phase 1 clinical trials, drugs can move into phase 2, which are more defined as effectiveness studies. In a particular group of patients, they're looking at the effectiveness of the drug. And as you can see, the number of patients participating in a phase 2 study is much higher than that of a phase 1. Following demonstration of safety and effectiveness in a phase 2 setting, many drugs will then move to a phase 3 clinical trial, which will compare the new drug to an existing drug or strategy. So these are comparison studies, and as you can see, may involve 100 to 1,000 plus patients, which will, for many of you, explain why it takes so long for some of these drugs to get to the FDA, is that questions need to be answered along the way, and many, many, many patients need to be participating in clinical trials to make that progress. Drugs may receive initial FDA approval following phase 2 studies and or phase 3 studies, and I'll describe that in a little more detail later. Phase 4 studies are those that are done following a drug's FDA approval, and so therefore are referred to as post-marketing studies, meaning that drug is now available in the market as far as pharmacy prescription use, and they're looking at long-term safety and effectiveness through the FDA on what are cumulative or long-term side effects. And again, these will involve several hundred to several thousand patients participating in the phase 4 studies. So if we take a step back and look at phase 1, these are clinical trials that involve a brand new drug or a combination of drugs that have not been given together before. And the question is, what is the appropriate dose and schedule? Patients often ask, Sutent is given 4 weeks on, 2 weeks off. Sorafenib, pazopanib, everolimus are given on a continuous dosing basis, and that really is based on the information obtained in the early phase 1 clinical trials. They identify possible side effects early on. They look for hints of effectiveness. And that is relative to the fact that phase 1 clinical trials really have the broadest eligibility or inclusion criteria. Patients typically can have any type of cancer, such as breast, colon, kidney, lung cancer, to be eligible for phase 1 clinical trials. They typically have failed whatever standard therapy was currently available. So when sorafenib or Nexavar, sunitinib or Sutent entered into the phase 1 clinical trials, there were no standard therapies. Patients may have had IL-2 or interferon or any other therapy, or there may have been no standard treatment available. There are inclusion criteria both to the number and type of prior treatments, and that varies significantly between studies. And so that is something that your physician and the research nurse involved will be asking questions and consider when the options are identified for treatments, including clinical trials for you. There are two particular components of phase 1 clinical trials referred to as PK and PD testing. And this looks at two very important components of drug administration. What does the agent do or the drug do to the human body and vice versa? So your PK or pharmacokinetic studies look at what the body does to a drug. How is a drug absorbed? How is the oral drug that you swallow absorbed into your system? How is it distributed to other organs? How is it metabolized either by the liver or the kidneys? And what is the excretion? And so these studies then involved a variety of blood testing, time point testing, things like that. Pharmacodynamic studies look at what the drug does to the body. What